All right, let's dig into one of the most common and most important causes of market failure: negative production externalities. This is where the market fails because the costs of production spill over onto third parties, people who aren't even directly involved in the production or consumption of the good. Think of it like this: a factory pollutes the air to produce cheap goods. The consumers pay for the product, the producer gets the profit, but how about the local community? They pay with dirty air and health problems. That's a negative externality of production. A negative production externality occurs when the production of a good creates external costs that aren't reflected in the market price. Remember the law of supply and increasing marginal costs? As firms increase their production, their marginal costs will also increase. But they will only produce more if the price received can cover their costs. But the price received depends on the consumer's demand, meaning the firm can't just raise prices. Instead, they control their costs, and higher costs incentivize the firm to produce less, and lower costs incentivize the firm to produce more. In the case of negative externalities, the private cost of production, like wages, materials, and rent, is lower than the social cost, which also includes the harm to others like pollution or noise. Because the producer isn't responsible for these additional costs, they are not incentivized to produce less. So they keep producing at the equilibrium quantity determined by the market. Instead, society bears the costs, so decreasing production is what would be best for society. Let's see what this looks like on a diagram. Remember, there are 4 different types of externalities: for production and consumption, but also for negative and positive externalities. They each have their own diagram, and you'll need to be able to draw each one. It's very easy for students to get these mixed up, so listen closely. In this lesson, we're talking about production externalities. Since it's about production, we're going to use the supply curve, which is also a cost curve. And remember, negative externalities mean that society pays a higher cost than the private firm. So we're going to draw the marginal social cost curve above the marginal private cost curve. Again, this represents the additional costs incurred by society than the private firm doesn't need to pay. We can actually measure the amount of additional cost by calculating the vertical height between the two curves. All right, now what about the demand curve? Remember, the demand curve is a benefits curve, so we need to think about who benefits. Think about it. No factory only creates pollution, right? A factory creates a product, and the pollution is a side effect of that process. That product is then sold in the market, and all of society can benefit from using that product, and the firm can benefit from the revenue gained by selling the product. In this way, the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal private benefits, so we can label the demand curve like this, and we don't need to draw another curve. Now, let's check out the points. Even though our diagram now shows the social costs, the product is still being bought and sold at the market price here, where marginal private benefits equal marginal private costs. We can label these price and quantity levels with an M for market. And this makes sense if you think about. Whenever you buy a product, you're usually only concerned with the benefits that you personally will get. You're usually not thinking about how your consumption of this product will affect the whole world. And on the seller side, they are usually only concerned about making profits and also not concerned with the effects on society. The buyer and seller are both doing what's best for their own interests. But to see what's best for society, we need to take into account these additional costs. So the socially optimum point is going to be here, where marginal social costs equal marginal social benefits. And we can label these price and quantity levels as OPT for optimum or SO for socially optimum. By looking at the quantity, we can see that there is an over-allocation of resources going to the production of the good, and too much of it is being produced. In other words, the people want less of it because of the negative effects on society. This is shown on the diagram by market quantity being greater than the socially optimum quantity, and also by MSC being greater than MPB. Now, let's talk about welfare loss. Whenever an externality exists, society is losing out, meaning they are either paying a higher cost or receiving less benefits. In the case of negative production externalities, it means society is paying a higher cost than what is socially optimal, and then results in a welfare loss. Okay, now a lot of students have trouble identifying where the welfare loss is on a diagram if it's not already labeled. So here are some cheat codes for you. First of all, the welfare loss will always be a triangle, and the point of the triangle will always be at the social optimum point. So find that on the diagram and put a point there. Okay, but now we need to decide which side the triangle is on. Negative externalities will always point to the left. Positive externalities will always point to the right. Positive externalities are when there's not enough of the right product, and negative externalities are when there's too much of the wrong product. So you can remember it this way: right is right and left is wrong. In our case, we have a negative production externality, so we want our triangle to point to the left. Therefore, our welfare loss is represented by this triangle. All right, but let's dive a little deeper into the cheat codes and see why they're correct. Remember, a negative production externality is the loss to society from additional costs that are not paid by the producer. Then it makes sense that we need to find the area represented by the vertical distance between the two supply curves, because this is the amount of the external costs. Okay, that's the additional costs. Now we need to consider the overproduction of additional units, so we need to look at the quantity. The horizontal distance between the socially optimum quantity and the market quantity tells us the amount of overproduction. So we're left with this area here, but we can exclude the area below the demand curve. Why? Remember, the demand curve represents the benefits. The area below the demand curve means that the benefits are still more than the cost, which is a gain for society. But once we go above the demand curve, our costs now become greater than the benefits, which is a welfare loss for society. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, you can always just use the cheat codes, but understanding it on a deeper level will help you later in the course when things get more complicated. And for you HL students, you'll need to be able to calculate the amount of welfare loss, which is really easy because it's just the area of that triangle. So you can use the formula of base times height divided by 2. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, so hopefully you got all that. But you may be thinking, so what? Well, the problem is that because private individual firms or consumers don't pay the full costs, they're more likely to overuse common pool resources. In this next section, we're going to talk about policies that aim to ensure that the individuals do pay some or all of this cost. However, even if the producer needs to pay all of these additional costs, it won't mean that they'll stop using common pool resources completely. Doing so would most likely mean stopping production altogether. So these common pool resources will still be used for production, but hopefully not overused, since the firm now has to take into consideration the added costs of production. Take this lady at Costco, for example. Now, she paid for the soda, but because she gets free refills, she doesn't need to pay for additional sodas. If she did, she probably wouldn't take so much. But in this kind of situation, people tend to take more than they need. That's just human nature. Now, you might not do it to this extent, but I'm guessing your school probably has free drinking water, and you often fill up your water bottle throughout the school day. Now, if your school started charging money to get water, that doesn't mean you would stop drinking water completely. But it probably means that you now drink less water than normal because you need to consider the additional costs. In other words, you would be a little bit more careful about your water consumption. And that's exactly why we need policies to correct this behavior, because otherwise the free market gives us no incentive not to use up all the resources. So what can be done about it? Well, Like with most concepts in economics, there are usually two schools of thought. One believes in letting the market solve the problem, and the other believes government intervention is needed. So we have both market-based policies and government legislation and regulation. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, so we'll look at each one separately. Let's start with market-based policies. This involves manipulating the market price to incentivize the desired behavior. The first market-based policy we'll discuss are indirect taxes placed on the per-unit output produced. For negative externalities, this indirect tax has a special name, Pigouvian tax, named after the English economist Arthur Cecil Pigou, who first came up with the idea as a way to correct a negative production externality. Because each unit of output is taxed, this increases production cost, which will then incentivize the firm to produce less. On a diagram, we can see that the indirect tax then pushes up the marginal private cost curve closer to the marginal social cost curve. The equilibrium price then rises closer to the socially optimum price. This corrects the market failure. Prices rise, output falls, and welfare loss is reduced. The next market-based policy is a carbon tax. This is a tax on the amount of carbon emissions, which are the main driver of global warming. This would also increase production costs, and therefore also shift the marginal private cost curve closer to the marginal social cost curve, in the exact same way as the Pigouvian tax, incentivizing the firm to produce less. The Pigouvian tax doesn't leave much choice for the firm. They can either choose to produce less or produce more and pay the tax. But a carbon tax gives additional incentives that don't involve lowering production. The firm can choose to switch to cleaner forms of production that pollute less or use green energy that doesn't pollute at all. This would mean that their production costs would become cheaper, meaning they could produce more. On a diagram, this would shift the marginal social costs down, since now we're talking about a decrease in the harmful effects to society. This means the new socially optimum quantity would be more than the previous one, but at a lower price, and moves the socially optimum point closer to the market equilibrium, thereby decreasing the external costs paid by society. This has the additional benefit of incentivizing firms to invest in research and development clean and renewable energy production methods, which may eventually lead to technological breakthroughs that benefit all of society. The third and final market-based policy we'll discuss is tradable permits. You can think of this as a permit to pollute. These are also known as a cap-and-trade system. Here, the government sets a limit or cap on total emissions, then gives or sells permits to firms, allowing them to pollute a certain amount. Remember, for the most part, pollution is a side effect of production. Decreasing production usually means decreasing production, which would hurt the economy. But then pollution hurts the environment, so it's not an easy decision to make. The obvious advantage with tradable permits is that the government can control how much total pollution is produced based on what they feel is an acceptable trade-off between pollution and production. A further advantage is that firms that pollute less can sell their permits to those who pollute more. This provides firms with a financial incentive to find cleaner ways to produce. Now, this diagram is going to look a lot different than the others because it won't be a diagram for the market of the goods being produced. Instead, it will be the diagram of the market for tradable permits. Because the government gives out a fixed number of permits, the supply is perfectly inelastic, which would be a vertical line. Of course, to be effective in reducing pollution, the government needs to measure it carefully so that the amount of pollution allowed by the tradable permits is less than the pollution when no permits were issued. So that will be the quantity of permits they decide on. And our demand curve represents the demand for those permits. Let's say the economy is growing. This means that firms will want to increase their production, but that also means increasing pollution. This means that there will be an increase in demand for the permits, and that will shift our demand curve to the right. And just like in regular competitive markets, we can see that an increase in demand will drive the price up to a higher equilibrium point. This system gives firms flexibility and incentives to innovate. However, the cap must be carefully set. Too loose, and pollution stays high. Too strict, and it can hurt industry. Okay, let's discuss the advantages and disadvantages of these market-based policies. Now, don't skip over this part. Actually, this is the stuff you really need to study. Remember, the IB is going to use a command term on these questions, like evaluate or discuss or analyze or something similar. And you'll need to provide a balanced argument where you discuss both the advantages and disadvantages of the topic. So whenever you see the advantages and disadvantages in my videos, make sure you pay attention and take notes because you need to know this stuff. First, the advantages of the market-based policies. As you might have noticed, all of the ones we discussed basically do the same thing. They all aim to have the producer internalize the externality. In other words, they try to make the firm pay for some or all of the costs of the harm they do to society. The first two policies we looked at were both taxes. However, a carbon tax, which is a tax on the pollution, has more advantages than a Pigouvian tax, which is a tax on the units of good produced. Therefore, a Pigouvian tax only incentivizes a firm to produce less, but not to try to find cleaner ways to produce. Even if a firm switched completely to clean production, they would still need to pay the same tax as other firms that pollute a lot more. By taxing the amount of pollution, it gives an incentive for a firm to try to find cleaner ways to produce in order to reduce costs. This will bring the marginal social cost curve down closer to the marginal private cost curve. However, this will be easier for some firms than others. If it is too expensive for a firm to switch to clean energy, then they will simply pay the tax. Then, this will bring the marginal private costs curve up closer to the marginal social cost curve. Either way, a carbon tax helps to close the gap between private and social costs. Tradable permits have a similar effect. If a firm can switch to clean production methods cheaply, then they will, and won't need their permits, which they can then sell to other firms. If it is too expensive for the firm to switch to clean production, then they will pay for the additional permits instead. Therefore, both carbon taxes and tradable permits are policies that reduce pollution more efficiently by rewarding the firms that can do it more cheaply and punishing the ones that can't. This is why most economists prefer market-based policies to deal with externalities. However, just like any other policy, there are some disadvantages as well. The main ones are technical. How do you measure pollution? Not only the amount, but how about the effects? Some pollution is more harmful than others, so how do you differentiate the two? How do you measure the true cost to society? And if you have difficulty measuring the amount of pollution, the effects of the pollution, and the true costs of the pollution, then how do you determine an appropriate amount to tax the pollution? In addition to that, indirect taxes are regressive. This means that the smaller firms will pay a higher percentage of their revenues to pay the tax. This might prevent smaller companies from developing, which would limit competition and possibly cause inefficiencies in the market. The same measuring difficulties also exist for tradable permits. But now, the government needs to decide what is the acceptable level of pollution in order to issue the correct amount of permits. If the amount is too low, then it has no effect. But if it's too high, it will limit production and hurt the economy. Now, let's discuss what legislation and regulation the government can enact to try to correct negative externalities of production. These would be laws created to force the desired behavior. Examples might include things like mandatory equipment or production methods, restrictions on pollution amounts, a complete ban on harmful chemicals, protecting certain areas like, for example, keeping factories away from residential areas. There are many different examples, but they usually involve either restrictions or requirements of the production process. These restrictions and requirements usually mean an increase in production costs, which would shift the private cost curve up closer to the social cost curve. This is done purposely to lower the quantity of the good produced and bring it closer to the socially optimum quantity. Any firm that does not comply with these regulations will be fined, which would also have the same effect as an increase in production costs. The biggest advantage of government regulation is that it is much easier to implement and monitor as compared to market-based policies, which are extremely difficult to measure. Here, there's a set of rules that everyone must follow, agencies set up to monitor it, and clear consequences for those who don't follow the rules. Compare this to the market-based policies where firms are allowed to continue to pollute if they choose to. But this advantage is also the biggest disadvantage. Because there are clear rules and consequences, this means there's less flexibility. Firms are forced to reduce their pollution the way the government says to. This means little incentive to research and develop innovative technology. This also means that firms do have the choice to change or not, meaning that all firms will need to change regardless of how difficult and costly that will be for them. So while yes, this will result in a decrease in pollution, it will be much more costly and less efficient than market-based policies. And because the regulation will only increase production costs and not incentivize firms to innovate, that means that only one thing will happen on a diagram. The private cost curve will shift upward to close the gap of external costs. But the social cost curve won't move down, since there is no incentive for the firms to try to find cleaner production methods. Along with all the previously mentioned difficulties in measurement, there's also additional costs incurred by the government to set up agencies to try to measure and monitor the externalities. This means it's costly, but also not very effective.
Besides market-based policies and government regulations, there are alternative ways to correct negative externalities of production. One is what's called collective self-governance. This happens when local groups, like farmers or fishers, agree on sustainable use rules and monitor each other's behavior. It works surprisingly well in small, tight-knit communities where trust and accountability are high. But it's harder to scale up to large international problems like climate change. Education is another long-term tool. Governments and NGOs can raise awareness about the environmental costs of production, helping consumers and producers make more responsible choices. This doesn't directly change market prices, but it shifts behavior gradually, encouraging sustainable production and consumption patterns. The advantage here is that firms care a lot about what their customers think, and their opinions can have a big influence on how the firm conducts their business. If customers learn that the firm is doing something that is harmful to society, the firm may change their ways, not because it's good for society, but to avoid a huge drop in sales from angry customers choosing not to buy from them. The disadvantage is that it usually only makes a small difference. The public may be able to target specific companies for committing specific harmful acts. But how do you address a much broader problem like global warming? There's not one company. Everyone has contributed to that problem. So for broad problems like this, market-based policies and government regulations are far more effective. But even these are limited, since they need the cooperation of the whole world. It won't make much difference if it's done by some countries and not others. This is why, for bigger problems, international agreements are needed. Think of the Paris Agreement. Countries collectively commit to reduce emissions with the goal to limit the rise of the global temperature to 1.5%. The advantage here is that they can make a big difference if everyone works toward the same goal. But enforcement is tricky, and cooperation depends on political will and economic incentives. Some countries may not want to work together due to political differences. Also, since a decrease in pollution usually means a decrease in production, some think these agreements are not fair for poorer developing nations, whose economy will be severely limited by the restrictions.
And there you have it. That's all you need for negative production externalities. In the next video, we'll cover negative consumption externalities and then positive externalities after that. But before you go, make sure you know all the learning objectives for this lesson. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.